Welcome to Energy Unplugged, our go-to podcast focusing on the global energy transition. And a particular welcome to this, our 200th edition of the podcast. My name is Dan Monzani, and I'm Aurora's Managing Director for UK and Ireland and European Hydrogen. But I'm hosting today's episode in my other capacity, overseeing Aurora's newly launched coverage of India. Aurora opened its office in Delhi in April, and we've launched our market entry multi-client study with our first subscriber group scheduled for next month. If you're interested in hearing more about that, firstly, listen on, but then please do reach out to our commercial team via the link in the episode description. This is the perfect subject for our 200th episode. As a global energy transition podcast, it's important to talk about India, as every viable pathway to a 2-degree global scenario must pass through India. It's impossible to care about climate change and not be vested in how India evolves. Moreover, for those of us interested in power markets and investment in renewables, India is fascinatingly poised for rapid growth and reform. Our guest today is the perfect person with whom to explore both those global and Indian themes. He is an eminent economist, academic, writer and policy leader who worked for the best part of 3 decades at the World Bank, rising to become their lead economist. He was the chief economist of the oil and gas super major Royal Dutch Shell between 2012 and 2016. In India, he served as a member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council and of the Reserve Bank of India's Technical Committee on Monetary Policy. He is currently Vice Chairman of NITI Aayog, reporting directly into the Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who acts ex officio as NITI Aayog's chair. NITI Aayog is both India's Ministry of Planning and its apex public policy think tank, bringing together senior union ministers and all of the chief ministers of the states. Our guest today is Suman Bery. Suman, welcome to Energy Unplugged.
Well, thank you, Dan. And I didn't realize it was the anniversary of this. That's a lot of podcasts, but I'm flattered. And of course, I have had some contact with Aurora in my time at Shell, and I'm pleased that you've chosen to open in India. Let me, since you mentioned NITI Aayog, just say a word or two about NITI Aayog. And then if I could, just a couple of things that your listeners might be interested in the energy transition in India. So you are right to call NITI Aayog the Ministry of Planning. That is indeed the way that we are represented in Parliament, because we have a Minister of Planning who speaks before Parliament. But in fact, this is a technical body. I think a very important part of everything that we're going to be talking about is the fact that India, apart from 1/5 of humanity, is a federal society. And as many of your listeners will perhaps know, we have just emerged from a 7-week-long electoral campaign, the outcome of which was that Prime Minister Modi, who you referred to, has been just sworn in for the 3rd time after 10 years in office as India's Prime Minister. And much of what we're going to be talking about actually does very much involve India's states. Now, just to go back to Paris, 2015, Prime Minister Modi, we have 5-year terms, and Prime Minister Modi was elected for the first time about this time of year, and so had barely been in office a year before the Paris COP. And in many ways, he single-handedly took the decision, which was contrary to the established position of the Indian bureaucracy, that India had much to gain by being part of the whole initiative for carbon mitigation. And India then committed to initial NDCs, and then those were updated again in 2022. And of course, we are coming up to another update of the NDCs at the COP in Brazil next year. I'm saying all this for a couple of reasons, because leadership does very much matter. And there's absolutely no question that Prime Minister Modi has led from the front on the energy transition. I would also say, and maybe this is anticipating something that will come up in more detail, that India is growing rapidly, but it remains in the G20, the country with the lowest real per capita income. And as Europe in particular, the UK, now start to set themselves up in judgment through instruments like the CBAM about is committed to decarbonization and who is not, I do think that recognition of the many things that we're going to talk about as indicators of commitment by India to mitigation, decarbonization are important. But the final point I would make, and I think this was borne testament to in our G20 presidency we handed over to Brazil last year, is that consistent with the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, energy has to be integrated into an overall development strategy. And I think one of the things that you wanted to talk about is what is the tightrope that India is going to try and walk in reconciling aspirations for energy access at the household level with decarbonization and fast growth, which is a goal of the government. So just wanted to set that out for those of your listeners who don't know India well.
That's brilliant, and definitely prefigures several themes we'll want to unpack as we go along. And I think a very good preemptive warning against sort of judging India's development pathway by Western standards, when many of the Western countries have had many years of emitting pollution at very high levels. But just to sort of fill in the detail on that, and correct me if I'm wrong here, India's committed, I think, to net zero by 2070. But energy independence, which actually presumes quite a lot of reduction in fossil fuel usage by 2047, the anniversary of political independence.
Yes, that is correct. But fossil fuel independence means imported a fossil fuel.
Yes.
And an important point, I think, given the vilification, if I may call it, of coal in the international organizations, in the financial system, is that actually India's fossil-based energy at the moment, primary energy supply, is 84%, and non-fossil-based primary energy is 16%. It turns out that those are not very different from G7 numbers. It's just that because coal is available to us and gas is expensive, as the Europeans are going to find out, it's expensive for them too. We've chosen to go the coal route. And of course, the US is gas coming out of its ears. So, let's, again, in the court of climate judgment, let's try and respect individual circumstances, both in terms of domestic supply and in terms of the development aspirations.
I mean, the other point to add on that, I suppose, is that actually the priority order for gas in India is somewhat different, isn't it? I mean, if you go to Delhi or Mumbai, people are driving around in gas-fueled cars rather than diesel-fueled cars. And that's a choice that India's made, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they are not reducing carbon intensity of some sectors in a different order to European markets.
Well, and, it's also the case that, again, with a focus on mitigation, that India remains committed to raising the share of gas, and this was restated by the Prime Minister at our Energy Week last year, raising the share of gas in the primary energy mix from 6% to 15%, but in, as it were, high-value applications. And some of that is going to have to be LNG. And again, what we have seen is committing yourself to LNG. You can be bid out of the market in the way that I think we have been by the needs of Europe. But fortunately, there is now supply coming in. Well, there was until President Biden put a pause on it. And indeed, we are beginning to import significant cargoes from the US of LNG. And we, from that point of view, are in a decent place geographically with Qatar and Mozambique and Australia all sort of in our neighborhood. So once things start settling down, it may well be that gas finds a more affordable place in our bouquet of primary energy sources. The important point I wanted to make is that self-sufficiency does not necessarily mean decarbonization. It means not being dependent on imported sources of fossil fuel, so to the extent that we have been up till now.
I'd like to look a bit more at those points within the broader context of Indian development, and there's a couple of angles on that. So first of all, I'm interested in how much infrastructure investment India's made over the last 10 years or so. I think transmission infrastructure alone has seen a 224% increase in interregional capacity alone. Perhaps with your old World Bank hat on, how important is that infrastructure investment as a growth driver in India, irrespective of the needs of climate change?
Well, it's taken a while for the world community to decide what counts as infrastructure. And there is a norm or an expectation that we should aim for infrastructure investment to be approximately 8% of GDP at our stage of development. I don't think we're quite there yet. I think perhaps, and this will also help us when we come to a conversation on funded finance, that a very important shift in budgetary priorities, which surprisingly has been particularly prominent post-COVID, has been that both the state governments and the union governments, but particularly the union government, has itself chosen to tilt its own expenditure towards capital expenditure, a lot of which is in infrastructure. But I believe the split between states and center in infrastructure is about 40-60. I don't want to be held to that. So states are also important players, and they are important players, particularly in transmission, but also actually in thermal and increasingly renewable generation. But your question was about a growth driver, and there are a number of ways you can think about this. You can think about it as investment that generates returns. I think what has been a big driver, even before we get to climate, is that this is what has been cited as a big difference between us and our peers in Southeast Asia in preventing competitiveness, our agricultural sector, our manufacturing sector. And so I would say connectivity, perhaps even more than energy, has been the dominant thrust of the infrastructure investment. And there's a lot to show for it, particularly in our highways program. Somehow we managed, with an early start, to come up with financing models and execution models that work. We instituted a tolling system, which took a while to settle down. And be aware that, I was a student in the UK as the M1 was, just being launched. And I know that land acquisition has been an issue in the UK as well. But the important point is that tolled motorway, well, in the UK, you don't have tolls, do you? No,
mostly not.
But tolled limited access roads are controversial if you don't have untolled alternatives. So, but nonetheless, we've come up with European type financing models. So I would say roads have been a big success. Railways are following. And very importantly, broadband, we've come up with a regulatory system where much of the broadband has been provided by the private sector with sufficient competition that India's broadband rates are the lowest in the world. And this has in turn ended up being a very big driver of a number of development initiatives, including financial inclusion, including the payment of government subsidies and transfers directly into people's accounts. So I would say that transport, energy, and digital have been the three thrusts in infrastructure, but we're still not quite where we perhaps want to be.
And I'm going to come on to that energy transition thrust, the forward look on that in a second. But just briefly to turn back to this question about India's development pathway. I mean, it's pretty clear if you spend time in Delhi or other parts of northern India at the moment. I was there last week. It was over 40 degrees. The week before, it was over 50 degrees. That India is having to grapple with the consequences of climate change at the same time as trying to plot its own development pathway. And I know NITI Aayog also has to think about a mission around living sustainably. So I suppose my question is, what is India's development pathway, and can you reconcile sustainability and mitigation with the kind of rapid economic catch-up that, of course, any middle-income country would want to see for its citizens?
Well, it was one of our original NDCs to reduce the emissions intensity of GDP by between 33 and 35% by 2030 from the 2005 level. And then when that was updated, that was enhanced to 45% by 2030. And we were on track, actually. The emission intensity of our GDP was reduced by 33% between 2005 and 2019. And why is that the most useful metric? It's because it shows that what has been happening in the West, what's been happening in California, which is that you can have GDP growth and through particularly energy efficiency, not just energy efficiency, through innovation. So I think that's the commitment, which is to say that technologies now do exist that allow GDP to grow without emissions growing at the same rate. And it's everything that is involved to keep on that path that adds up, if you will, to a program. Now, my work at Shell, working on Shell scenarios, made several things clear. One is that there are big differences in energy intensity between Europe and the United States, Canada, Australia, partly a question of geography, but also reflecting things like urban form, urban pattern. And what India has going for it, although it's a huge political and administrative task, is that much of the infrastructure, the industry, the city that will exist by 2047 or 2070 are still in prospect. And so if you can find a way of financing the best technologies in materials, in construction, then you can keep on this glide path. Now, there is a separate dimension to this, which was exemplified by the distinction between Northern Europe and Southern Europe in the Shell work, which is that Southern Europe was more services-oriented, tourism-oriented, light manufacturing-oriented. Northern Europe was much more steel and chemicals, particularly Germany. And an interesting comparison would be with Japan and South Korea. So they had no energy resources to speak of, but because energy was cheap and because geopolitically it was the Pax Americana, they went for as did China, went for a very heavy industry-focused strategy. India still believes that its manufacturing peak lies ahead of it, but it also sees that there are decarbonization strategies for manufacturing. And so certainly everything from CCUS to hydrogen, these are now initiatives, what we call missions, expressed interest in that, which are designed to make sure that new technologies are adopted. But at the end of the day, all of this does require systems of management and governance, which I would say that our richer states are demonstrating. I think the real issue is going to be in the poorer states, and there's a difference in per capita income of 6:1 or 5:1 between our richest and poorest states, and with that goes state capacity, etc.
That's interesting. And actually, just before we turn to the specifics around the energy transition, let's pick up on that point about mission and governance, because it's a huge country, as you say, a fifth of humanity, 1.4 billion people. And I was really struck by the role that NITI Aayog has in leading cross-governmental, indeed cross-federal missions. Take a slightly British angle on this. We're in the middle of an election campaign ourselves, not of the scale of the Indian election, of course, but one in which the opposition Labour Party has promised to organise its government around 5 overarching missions. So I suppose with a British hat on, as well as an Indian interest, I'm fascinated to know what you think of the advantages of that cross-cutting, mission-led approach to delivering economic strategy.
Well, let me first say that the Prime Minister is very emphatic that NITI Aayog's role is to pioneer, to seed ideas, but that implementation should remain the responsibility of line ministries for reasons of accountability. And so let me take as an example our electric mobility initiative. So this was before my time, but I'm told that there were evangelists, let me put it that way, at NITI who foresaw that India was already a fairly successful auto exporter, but that ICE engines were probably on their way out, and that if we and there are other domestic reasons as well, including particularly local air pollution, but that if we wanted to be in on the ground floor of what was going to be the next stage in mobility, that we needed to gear ourselves up for electric mobility. Now, we've not been anywhere near as successful as China in four-wheelers, but a lot of mobility in India is 2- and 3-wheelers, and arguably we've been pretty successful in that. And it's been a very interesting example of the public sector creating a policy framework and our entrepreneurial sector following. The link with the idea of mission is that articulating a game plan and developing a consensus around it, which involves multiple stakeholders and multiple ministries, but then to make it a legislative reality, this becomes a cabinet note, and it goes through the cabinet review process. And then if legislation is needed, as it often is, then it is presented to Parliament. Now, that said, I mean, certainly something that, I think Britain has pioneered, which people comment on favorably, has been the Committee on Climate Change. We don't have anything like that in India at the minute, nor do we have, unlike both Britain and I think some of the European countries, a formal legal commitment to net zero target. But the commitment to net zero by 2070, nonetheless, was a very important marker, the next step after the NDC, about India wanting to reconcile its development aspirations and its fossil fuel resource endowment with a commitment to a global initiative. But I do want not to lose sight of the point that you made earlier, which is that for India, climate change is at least as much about adaptation as it is about mitigation. And if you come to the use of public resources, and if you come particularly to the use of public resources at the state level, arguably adaptation is going to chew up as much of what's available as is mitigation. And so there is little option to create a policy framework where the private sector takes on the burden of mitigation in hydrogen, in electric mobility, etc. And it's happening.
Let's dig into some of the specifics then around the particularly the power sector. India's got hugely ambitious goals here. 50 gigawatts per year renewables deployment is the target in order to get to 500 gigawatts by 2030. One of the most transformative steps, as I understand this, has been firstly the Indian state putting sovereign backing behind auctions, and so sort of fixed price with a sort of sovereign backing behind those auction payments, and then innovating around the design of those auctions to move beyond a sort of standard pairs produced PPA design to various fixed load following profiles to be met by complex portfolios. I'm interested, having seen that path of evolution, how you expect those state contracts for renewables to evolve in the future.
I've been more fluent, Dan, in the bits we've talked about now. I'm not a power geek, and so this is the guidance I've gotten from some of our specialists. It may not be as granular as you might wish, but my general understanding has the following elements. First, it's a federal country, and different states have adopted different policies. They have different ownership schemes in distribution. And what in India is called the DISCOM problem has haunted India for at least the last couple of decades, because it turns out that subsidized power is a very attractive populist scheme or populist slogan. And so how to bring in private sector generators into a public grid, and more importantly, regulated but still politically fragile DISCOMs it has been a challenge for at least 20 years. Okay. So we had an important transition that took place, I would say, in the 1990s, when a system which was a bit like, I think, the UK before Thatcher's, which was that you had public generators and it was all in the public sector. But because of fiscal constraints, as well as to try and get contestability, a regulatory framework was established which allowed private merchant generators to enter into the system. And to provide comfort to them, a legal structure arose around long-term power purchase agreements. So that transition from wholly public sector to the private sector took place, but still in a system of thermal, which was largely dominated by the public sector. And, you've known in the UK with the issue with, say, an organization like BT, which is that you can privatize these things, but they retain many of their, if you like, preferred situations. Okay, so on top of that, you're now trying to, in the existence of these PPAs, you're now trying to encourage a new set of completely private players to come in with wind and solar, and they have to, as it were, make space with existing fossil PPAs and in a situation where the DISCOMs are not in, as it were, the pink of health. And that is why, as it were, sovereign guarantees have had to come in to provide comfort not only to the generators, but ultimately to their financiers, that, there will be an interface between, as it were, the final distributor and the generator. Now, the question is, how long is this fiscally sustainable? How long is it necessary? because as the share of renewables rises, then the contingent liabilities on the state, on the union government, will rise. So now we come to this having sort of worked. Now your question is, what's the experimentation and where might that lead? The experimentation is to go from so-called plain vanilla solar and wind to hybrid. And why would you do that? You would do that because ultimately what you want is the guarantee of stable power. And that really involves 2, 3, and maybe 4 elements. It involves wind, solar, which is the dominant, then wind, maybe some base load as well, and then finally storage. And so there's a process of price discovery going on as we speak about what does it take for this complex bundle to be delivered to DISCOMs, who ultimately are concerned just with the electrons and not where the electrons came from. If that's the model and you are committing yourself to near round the clock, if not round the clock, then the penalties for default are high, and you would be inclined to, as it were, over build or over design. And then that creates an opportunity for power markets. So that's my somewhat simplistic understanding of where we are. But I hope it provides your listeners with some idea of the journey we've been on.
Yeah, and it's been a very effective journey. I think that last point is one that really interests us and many of our clients in India, which is if you're trying to get a balance of wind and solar yields to match a load profile, you do indeed oversize, and that means you're spilling power onto a wholesale market. We've seen quite a lot of growth in the liquidity of the Indian wholesale market. It's pretty likely to continue growing given those auction structures. But I'm just interested, partly philosophically, about the role of government in promoting liquidity and open competitive markets as a means to an end. And there's one view of the world that says actually governments need to do the stuff that markets aren't going to do, and another view of the world that says actually governments ought to work hard to make sure liquidity is increased in those markets, and in fact perhaps those incomplete markets for some of the technical services around the system are created. Where would you say India is philosophically on that? Is it government's role to create new markets and increase liquidity, or do they leave that alone to the private sector?
No. I think, India, so perhaps to a fault, many of our public, by charter, many of our public agencies, and not only in energy, are seen to have a market development responsibility. So, for example, where we are in a completely different field, which is our payment system, almost all of the infrastructure and indeed some of the entities, we have something called the National Payments Corporation of India Limited, was carved, CALVED, out of the Reserve Bank. Okay, so similarly, our insurance regulator and even some of the insurance companies, they have both a regulatory role and a development role. So there, I think, is an appropriate appreciation that we don't have, if you like, the market and the legal infrastructure to assume that the development of markets will happen on its own. But there is a lot of reason for optimism. I was on leave from the World Bank at the Reserve Bank of India when again, as an act of public entrepreneurship to break the monopoly of the Bombay Stock Exchange, the National Stock Exchange was set up by a consortium of public sector banks, and I think the RBI may have also had a stake in it. And, here we are, that was 1993, I think, here we are 30 years later that India has now a very vibrant equities culture. I think it's become the 4th largest equity market in the world. So, and I think we can hope to see a similar handoff taking place. I'm advised that we now have 3 trading companies. So philosophically, I think there is no sense that the government has no business being a promoter. I think, fortunately, Indian entrepreneurship does mean that if it's not barred, then people will find ways of entering these markets. And there's a new entrant in the power exchanges that you must know about called the Hindustan Power Exchange, and so people, a bit like Aurora, are probably looking to growth in this area for the reasons that we've discussed.
Fascinating. I want to actually pivot back to, it's been really interesting to think about India and managing its own development, but also India has an important role within the global economy and indeed the global political economy. And I wanted to just spend the last few minutes of our conversation exploring both the opportunities and the risks there. Firstly, perhaps around manufacturing. That's 500 gigawatts of renewables is a lot of supply chain apart from anything else. And everybody in the world is grappling with the dominant scale of Chinese manufacturing at the moment, over 80% of solar panel module production, for example. What's your view on whether India can build a domestic manufacturing capacity that depends less on China without slowing progress against its targets?
Look, as with all of these industrial policy decisions, there's a price to be paid. There's no question about it. But after all, when I was at Shell, it was Germany who first took the world down the cost curve. But I think in 2016, when I left Shell, I don't think anybody foresaw how learning by doing. There's a public policy issue, and then I'll talk as an analyst. The public policy issue is, are you giving up employment opportunities? And my answer to that would be that I think most of the evidence is that's actually the downstream stuff, that where most of the employment is. And so it's certainly the case that you and some of the existing private sector players are, from that point of view, unhappy that they're being cut off from the lowest cost source of supply. I think, to me, the biggest concern, Dan, would be, do we create then an ecosystem which gets complacent and doesn't keep up with the technological changes? So a optimistic scenario would be that through our so-called production-linked incentive scheme, we give the whole sector a certain amount of temporary protection, which is linked with certain targets, and then good things start happening in terms of economies of scale, supply chains, this, that, and the other. So that's the good scenario, the optimistic scenario. The more pessimistic scenario is that people get lazy, and as technology kind of evolves in the world. But we had a similar choice with 5G, where Huawei was a very important supplier to our competitive telephony firms. And they were, frankly, a lobby against excluding Huawei. But I think a decision was taken by government, rightly or wrongly, that there were risks. And what do you know? That now 6G is being developed in India by Reliance, and I have no way of commenting on whether that's state of the art or not. But I think it's a matter of judgment whether you have an ecosystem which will catch the ball and run with it. And I think that's what we have to hope for. It is in some ways too important an input for us to go cold turkey on it, I think.
I think lots of countries around the world are coming to similar conclusions. Just to frame that the other way around, of course, because there are plenty of things that could be produced in India that you might worry other countries would put protectionist barriers up against. And one of them I wanted to test with you is around hydrogen or ammonia. India is potentially a very low-cost place to produce green hydrogen for exports. And so I'm interested in whether you see there as a big opportunity for the Indian economy to produce ammonia or hydrogen for a global market, or are policies elsewhere in the world, like the EU's CBAM, you mentioned it earlier, are those really ways of decarbonising, or do you see a risk that they become protectionist barriers that are there to protect imports from outside of Europe?
My sense, Dan, is it's going the other way on hydrogen. So CBAM is much more of a concern for us when it comes to steel. On hydrogen, what we've been told is that Europe is going to be short, and my concern is a slightly different one. My concern is that is it a sound deployment of what are still rationed renewable energy resources to commit them to, as it were, an exportable good like hydrogen? Because, we need it for all kinds of domestic reasons as well. But on your more limited question of whether I see hydrogen embedded in ammonia or other forms of transporting hydrogen, the costs of which are not fully established yet, that being subject to CBAM, that I've not heard. It could happen, but the question is who would pull the plug? Maybe later on, if hubs like the one that you have coming up on Teesside, etc., feel that this is competitive, we don't know. So that's why, as it were, our diplomacy, including, for example, trade deals with both the EU and with the UK, which are underway, do need to anticipate some of these dimensions. We talk of other aspects of environment as forming chapters in these agreements, but measures like CBAM should also be subject to negotiation.
Very good. My final question was precisely on this sort of global political leadership. How can India lead on the global stage to shape global climate agreements in a way that supports India's economic growth?
Well, I think the G20 was a good example in two respects. One is we did bring the conversation rather firmly back to the UN's SDGs, which have, SDG 7, goals for energy, but within an overall development framework. And I would say that this was perhaps something of an advance compared with the duality of the Glasgow COP and the Italian G20 presidency, where it was mitigation to the exclusion of anything else. Okay? So I think that recognizing that the carbon constraint is a stock constraint, yes, that carbon emitters have a responsibility, but also that they have a responsibility to their own population. So bringing some balance into that discussion, I think, is a contribution that India can make and has been trying to make. And it's interesting that what finally was agreed at the last COP on the tripling of renewables capacity actually had its origin in the Indian G20 presidency. So that these are ways in which, as it were, the debate can be reframed. Now, I think that I've already mentioned why, seen from Indian eyes, singling out coal is somewhat invidious. It may well be that its carbon intensity is higher than that of natural gas, but I think if you have an overall commitment to reduce the carbon emissions intensity of GDP on a certain glide path, then there should be sufficient flexibility to leave the energy choices. After all, Europe, did have to go back to lignite briefly in response to geopolitical concerns. We don't live in the most tranquil of geopolitical neighborhoods. And so to hold on to a certain energy source because it's available domestically, I don't think is unreasonable. And I may also finally add on my side that I don't think they got much of a hearing at the G7, but my Japanese interlocutors tell me that when Japan was helming the G7 last year, they, in a sense, pleaded with their G7 partners to recognize that Asia is different. It's important for emissions. It has a much younger thermal fleet than Europe, and that one size fits all should not be, as it were, the yardstick for judgment, which is really what, to some extent, CBAM represents. It'll be interesting to see how CBAM is relaxed for the US, for example, because they'll have to presumably do some contortions to establish that the US has a carbon market, if that's the litmus test. So those are some of my thoughts.
Fascinating. And we've ranged very widely across the Indian economy, and particularly around the role of the energy transition in it. We could go on forever, but we must stop. Thank you so much, Suman Bery. It's been fantastic to have you on Energy Unplugged.
Okay, well, thanks for the opportunity, and good luck with your Indian venture.
That was Dan Monzani, Managing Director at Aurora and responsible for our activities in India, talking to Suman Bery, Vice Chairman of NITI Aayog. Thanks for listening to Energy Unplugged. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to follow or subscribe to the podcast via whatever platform you use.